Good evening. I am honored and excited to have this opportunity to exchange ideas with Dr. Craig. Let's begin by considering a simple example. Imagine that on your way home tonight, you encounter a child whose arm is engulfed in flames. Suppose the child is screaming in pain and for help, and that nearby is a large bucket of water. No one else is around. Now, Craig and I agree that in this scenario, the suffering of the child is bad, and that you are morally obligated to try to douse the flames. We also agree that these facts about badness and obligation are objective. We disagree, however, about the nature of the badness of the child's suffering and of the obligation to help the child. In his opening speech, Dr. Craig said that God's character is the absolute standard of value, and that divine commandments constitute our moral obligations or duties. Craig's view is that for an act to be morally obligatory, just is for that act to be commanded by God, in much the way that for something to be water, just is for it to be H2O. For Craig, the badness of the child's suffering consists in that suffering conflicting with God's character, and your obligation to help the child consists in God having commanded you to help. Atheists must reject such a view. Some atheists deny the reality of objective morality. Others propose that moral features are really just natural features of the world. Dr. Craig and I both find such views to be implausible. My view is that these moral features of things are fundamental features of reality, not reducible to any other thing. That is not to say that the moral features of reality do not have sources. In the child on fire case, the intrinsic nature of the child's suffering makes that suffering bad. The suffering is bad in and of itself, just as on Craig's view, God is good in and of himself. Furthermore, the child's suffering, the presence of a bucket of water, and so on, give rise to your moral obligation to douse the flames. As Dr. Craig explained in his opening speech, my theory is that various features of the situation cause you to be obligated to help, and this causal connection is as strong as that between God willing that a certain thing happen and the willed thing happening. My aim tonight is to make the case that my view is more plausible than Dr. Craig's view. Since we are considering the relative plausibility of two views, whenever we are presented with an objection to one of the views, we should consider whether there is a similar objection to the other view, so that the two objections cancel each other out. It seems to me that a great many of the objections to my view that Dr. Craig advanced in his opening speech are matched by corresponding objections to his view. For example, consider Craig's argument that my proposed causal connection between natural and moral features of reality is implausible because it is difficult to imagine how such a causal connection could hold. Craig's view posits causal connections between wholly non-physical entities, such as God and souls on one side, and the physical universe on the other. When Descartes championed such a view back in the 17th century, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia objected that it is difficult to imagine how such a causal connection could hold. And dualism's critics have complained ever since that the nature of this alleged causal relationship is, in Craig's words, wholly obscure. The prominent metaphysician Peter van den Wagen, to whom Craig appealed as an authority on metaphysical matters in his opening speech, rejects dualism on precisely these grounds. So there is no advantage for Craig's view here. The same is true of Craig's charge that I cannot explain why a given physical situation possesses one moral feature rather than another. Craig's view faces a corresponding challenge. On Craig's view, if God commands you to do something, then necessarily you have a powerful reason to do that thing. But what explains why there is a necessary connection between an act being commanded by God and there being a powerful reason to do the act? What if instead being commanded by God entails there being a powerful reason not to do the act? This worry mirrors Craig's worry that I cannot explain why, for example, the natural features of the child on fire scenario make it morally obligatory for you to help the child rather than to fan the flames. Furthermore, Craig's skepticism about the natural world's ability to generate moral features of things should be viewed in the context of his commitment to the existence of an unsurpassably good person who is generated by nothing. Craig's Anselmian view has it that a causeless, unsurpassably good being exists in every possible universe. Craig wonders how, on my view, a given situation knows which moral features to instantiate. We might similarly wonder how, on Craig's view, every single possible universe knows to instantiate exactly one uncreated being that is loving, generous, faithful, kind, and unsurpassably good. How do the various properties know to knit themselves together in every possible universe? The upshot here is that both Craig's view and mine posit unexplained necessary connections, and hence it is fruitless for one of us to complain about the other's commitment to such connections. Now, Craig also says that my view imputes to physical objects causal powers that are completely unknown to contemporary physics, and for that reason is a sort of voodoo metaphysics. But Craig's dualism implies that some physical objects can causally influence non-physical souls, causal powers that are also unknown to contemporary physics. And so I say to Dr. Craig, join me, brother, in the church of voodoo metaphysics. Craig also alleges that my view undermines the existence of the self, free will, and moral knowledge. Since Craig simply asserts that on my view there is no enduring self, but provides no explanation of how my view might have such an implication, there's not really an argument here to which I might respond. In the case of free will and moral knowledge, Craig's arguments rest on the claim that my view implies that mental states have no causal impact on the physical world. Craig notes that I accept the widely held causal closure of the physical principle, according to which any physical event that has a cause has a complete physical cause. Craig further claims that this principle implies that mental states are causally effete. However, the causal closure principle by itself does not secure that conclusion. The further premise that no mental state is also a physical state is required. But the claim that no mental state is also a physical state is highly contentious. There are various theories about how mental states could be reducible to or constituted by certain sorts of physical states. Because Craig doesn't address any of these theories, his claim that I must deny that mental states can affect the physical world is inadequately supported. Additionally, Dr. Craig's own theories about free will, the self, and moral knowledge require causal interaction between the physical and non-physical, which, as I noted earlier, has been questioned in precisely the way Craig questions the causal interaction between the physical and the moral. A more interesting objection Craig poses is that my view is incompatible with morally supererogatory acts. Craig offers the examples of sacrificing your life for others and becoming a doctor rather than an engineer. I have two thoughts here. First, I'm not convinced that Craig's view allows such acts to be above and beyond what is morally obligatory. Although Craig spoke only of generic theism in his opening speech, his view is a version of Christian theism, according to which one of God's central commands to us is to love others as we love ourselves. If you could save the lives of others by sacrificing your own life or becoming a doctor rather than an engineer, it seems plausible that you'd be morally obligated to do so in order to live up to a moral requirement to love others as you love yourself. So, if Dr. Craig wishes to press the supererogation objection, he owes us an explanation of how his own view, accommodates his own examples. Second, my view could be tweaked to allow for the possibility of supererogatory acts by incorporating Joseph Raz's concept of exclusionary permission. Raz suggests that there is value in us being able to form our own plans and ideals for our lives, and that value can generate reasons to refrain from acting on the total balance of moral reasons, if doing so would be deeply at odds with our own life plans. Acting on the total balance of moral reasons anyway in such cases is supererogatory. This approach fits nicely with Craig's doctor example. If you've built your life around becoming an engineer, that can give you a reason to refrain from acting on the total balance of moral reasons and becoming a doctor. On this approach, an act is morally obligatory for you, just in case you have decisive moral reasons for doing it and no exclusionary permission to refrain from acting on those reasons. So Craig's remarks about supererogatory acts don't reveal an advantage of his view over mine. I turn now to challenges for Craig's theistic account of objective morality. I will present three such challenges. In his opening speech, Craig said that while divine commands provide unconditional obligations to perform certain actions, my view fails to provide a basis for unconditional moral obligations. These remarks reveal a claim that lies at the foundation of Craig's critique of secular morality, as well as his influential moral argument for God's existence. The claim is that there is one and only one feature that can give rise to genuine moral obligations, and that feature is being commanded by God. But this claim is implausible. Recall the child in flames case I described earlier. Consider the following elements of that case. The child is in agony. You can easily reduce his agony at no cost to yourself, and no one else can help the child. Craig's position is that those features of the situation do not generate a genuine obligation to help the child. On Craig's view, God's command alone creates the obligation to help. Such a position is at odds with moral common sense. Imagine a view according to which the one and only thing that can make you morally obligated to do something is making a promise to do that thing. On this view, if you encounter a suffering child who you and no one else can help, you're only obligated to help if you've previously made a promise to help suffering children. Indeed, you're only obligated to refrain from torturing children for your own entertainment if you've previously promised not to do so. The straightforward defect in this view is that there are a whole host of features of the world that can generate moral obligations aside from promise-making. Craig's view of morality is similarly flawed in that it mistakenly identifies one morally relevant feature as the only possible source of moral obligations. My theory, by contrast, accommodates the common sense view that divine commands, promises, needless and easily preventable suffering, along with a host of other factors, can generate genuine moral obligations. A second challenge for Craig's view stems from the fact that commands carry moral weight for the people to whom they are issued only to the extent that those people are aware of the commands and the authority of the commander. Consider parents and children. Parents have some authority to lay moral obligations on their children by commanding them to do things, at least when the children are sufficiently young. But such commands create obligations only when the children are aware of those commands and the authority behind them. For example, a parent cannot lay moral obligations on her children via anonymous notes that the children do not realize originate with the parents. Or consider my son, who, upon seeing me approach with a certain look on my face, will sometimes close his eyes, cover his ears, and run away, so that he cannot receive any command I might try to give him. Suppose that while he is in this state, I command him to retrieve a particular toy from beneath the sofa cushions. My command does not lay upon him an actual obligation to retrieve that toy. While he is subject to moral criticism on various grounds, he is not guilty of violating an obligation to retrieve the toy, for no such obligation was created in place. The relevance of this is that there are many non-believers in the world who are either unaware of or do not recognize divine authority behind any divine command. God's commands fail to impose moral obligations upon these non-believers. And given Craig's position that all human moral obligations are constituted by divine commands, Craig's view has the implausible implication that non-believers have no moral obligations whatsoever. I should emphasize that the problem is not that Craig's view implies that non-believers lack knowledge of their moral obligations. Rather, the problem is that Craig's view implies that non-believers literally lack moral obligations altogether. A third challenge is that Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong actions inexplicable. Consider the child in flames case. On Craig's view, the immorality of ignoring the child consists in there being a divine command to help the child. Some people would ignore the child despite being divinely commanded to help. Being omniscient, God knows in advance that such people will ignore the child despite his commands. So what reason does God have to command those people to help the child? On Craig's view, the act of ignoring the child is already evil independently of God's command. By commanding those he knows won't obey anyway to help the child, God exacerbates the evil of ignoring the child, making it also a case of violating a moral obligation. It can't be that God issues the command in an attempt to prevent the evil act from being performed, since he knows in advance that the command won't prevent the act. The command makes the act more evil, which gives God a reason not to issue the command. God can give different commands to different people. Why wouldn't he issue a command only when the command would make a difference in the commanded person's behavior? Craig's theistic approach appears to predict a world in which no one ever violates a moral obligation, and that is clearly not our world. I'll conclude by summarizing the main claims I've made. First, the issue before us is whether my view or Craig's view is more plausible. That means that whenever we are evaluating the force of a given objection to one of these two views, we should always consider whether there is a corresponding objection to the other view. As I've argued, many of Craig's objections to my view are matched by corresponding objections to his own view, and so provide no reason to favor his view over mine. Craig's remaining objections are inadequately supported or can be met. Most importantly, I've explained three considerations that support my view over Craig's. The first is that Craig singles out divine commands as the only possible source of moral obligations, thereby arbitrarily selecting one of many apparently weighty moral features as the only one that can ground moral obligations. The second is that Craig's view yields the implausible result that non-believers have no moral obligations at all. Finally, morally wrong acts are inexplicable on Craig's view, since they require that God inexplicably commands people to do what he knows they won't do anyway, thereby pointlessly introducing additional evil into the world. When we put these three considerations together, we see that there are tensions between Craig's view and some of the most fundamental elements of morality, tensions that my view does not possess. And so it seems to me that my view is the more plausible of the two views under consideration here. Okay, I'm grateful to Dr. Craig for his clear and thoughtful response. Two preliminary points. First, Craig says my views and metaphysical commitments are more substantial than those of theism. Suppose he's right. Does it follow that my view is less plausible than his, all things considered? Only if Craig's view can make sense of objective morality as well as mine, which, as we'll see, it cannot. Second, if the topic of debate is whether my old man is a jerk, it's irrelevant for me to point out that your old man tortures puppies. But if the topic is whose old man is more of a jerk, and you say my old man tortures puppies, then your old man's treatment of puppies is relevant. If both old men torture puppies, then the puppy torturing issue sheds no light on whose old man is the bigger jerk. With that in mind, let's consider Craig's criticisms of my old man. Recall the child in flames. I say that various features of that scenario, the child's suffering, the presence of a bucket of water, and so on, cause your moral obligation to douse the flames. Craig thinks that the child has a physical body and an immaterial soul, and that the child's immaterial soul causally affects the child's body. He says that natural to moral causation is more obscure than immaterial to material causation. But the alleged obscurity lies in the absence of a theory about how the causation occurs. And such a theory is equally absent in both cases. So there's no basis for claiming that one case is more obscure than the other. On Craig's rhetorical question about how situations know which moral properties to instantiate, consider Craig's Anselmian commitment to the view that certain properties are great-making properties that necessarily make things that have them great. Examples include power and knowledge. God allegedly possesses great-making properties to the maximum degree. That's what makes him unsurpassably great. But how do such properties know to enhance the greatness of things that have them? I say that being an instance of causing pain just for fun is necessarily wrong-making. Craig says that being powerful is necessarily great-making. Why do these properties work this way? I don't see why the answer they just do is more plausible in one case than the other. Craig says that my view undermines free will. His argument requires the controversial premise that no mental states are reducible to brain states. In his last speech, he claimed that, quote, this sort of reductionism has long since been exposed as inadequate among philosophers of mind, end quote. As a claim about the current state of the debate in philosophy, this is simply inaccurate. Craig also makes unsupported claims about what physical things cannot do. Given how limited our understanding of intentionality, agency, and the brain are, I frankly can't imagine what basis Craig thinks he has for such claims. Furthermore, no one has the slightest inkling as to how an immaterial soul can supposedly possess intentionality and agency. In light of all of this, the suggestion that immaterial souls can possess such features, but complex physical systems cannot, is nothing more than a wild guess. Craig also appeals to Plantinga's evolutionary argument. Plantinga argues, from the armchair, that any forming creature produced by unguided evolution will probably tend to have lots of false beliefs. I'd say that if you want to know what sort of widgets a widget maker is likely to produce, then you should consider the widgets it has made. Similarly, if you want to know what sort of creatures unguided evolution is likely to make, then you should consider the creatures it has made. It seems to me that all creatures on Earth have been produced by unguided evolution. And the inspection of these creatures casts doubt on Plantinga's probability claim. For what we find are creatures that are pretty good at forming true beliefs, at least within certain domains. Dogs can't do philosophy, but they're pretty good at forming true beliefs about their immediate surroundings. Psychology is revealing more and more about the strengths and weaknesses of human cognition. While the picture is mixed, it's certainly not the case that humans tend to have false beliefs across all domains. Consideration of what unguided evolution has actually produced suggests that it tends to produce pretty reliable believers, and Plantinga's argument therefore fails at its first step. Finally, on supererogation, Craig says that on theism, you can fulfill your duty to be a loving person without being morally obligated to give up your life for someone else. But Christian philosopher Christian Miller notes that another Christian command is to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Commenting on this and other biblical passages, Miller concludes, quote, "For Christian theists, there seems to be no obvious textual evidence that God considers certain actions to be supererogatory. Instead, the New Testament authors are moved to stress the importance of forgiveness and grace, since no one will ever live up to their obligations on their own, much less go beyond them." End quote. So Craig's supererogation objection remains inconclusive. Now, what about my three challenges for Craig's view? Craig says that God imposes moral obligations on non-believers because he, quote, "has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, so that they have an intuitive grasp of the content of God's commands and their authority." End quote. But the existence of psychopaths refutes this theological claim. Psychopaths are incapable of empathy, love, or guilt, and cannot grasp the authority of moral demands. As psychologist Robert Hare explains, psychopaths lack the shackles of a nagging conscience. Psychologists Cordelia Fine and philosopher Jeanette Kennett say that for psychopaths, moral rules are annoying restrictions to be manipulated or ignored. None of these rules have normative force for them. Since psychopaths are incapable of grasping the authority of moral demands, it seems that God has not given them moral obligations, which means that on Craig's view, they have no obligations at all. This is a big problem for Craig, because one of his complaints about atheism is that it implies that psychopaths can do nothing wrong. Next, Craig's attempt to explain the existence of wrong action fails. Suppose God gives each of us an individualized conscience and commands us through it. Suppose each of us will encounter a flaming child after the debate. Suppose God knows that if he commands you to help, that will make the difference between whether you'll help or not. So he commands you to help, which you freely do, and the child is saved. But suppose God knows that regardless of whether he commands me to help, I'll heartlessly ignore the child. Given that, why bother with the command? The child won't be saved anyway, and my failure to help becomes a sin, introducing more evil into the world. Here's Dr. Craig's idea. I deserve punishment for heartlessly ignoring the child. So God commands me to help so that he can then punish me when I don't. But this is confused. If I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. On the other hand, if what makes me deserve punishment for ignoring the child is that in doing so I violate a divine command, then the fact I deserve punishment obviously can't be God's reason for issuing the command in the first place. Craig's confusion here shows in his claim that without general divine commands in place, evildoers would, quote, literally get away with murder, end quote. But Craig holds that murder is wrongful killing, and without a divine command against killing, there's no wrongful killing on his view, and so no murder. Therefore, Craig cannot consistently say that without divine commands, evildoers would get away with murder, and the existence of wrong action remains inexplicable on his view. Finally, Craig says that only divine commands can be the ultimate source of moral obligations, meaning that only divine commands are sufficient by themselves to generate moral obligations. Again, consider the child in flames. Think of the child's agony and terror and how easily you could help. On Craig's view, those things by themselves cannot make it wrong for you to walk on by. Let's scale things up. Suppose you could stop 1 million Holocausts just by lifting a finger. To believe Craig's view, you have to believe that that by itself cannot generate a duty to lift that finger, cannot make it wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that only an order from God can do that. Further, Craig's view implies that without God, there is nothing evil about 1 million Holocausts. Perhaps Craig will say that's because without God, there are no souls and so no pain, but that won't do. Keep the souls, keep the agony and terror of 1 million Holocausts, and Craig's view still says that without God, nothing bad is happening. That simply isn't plausible. To conclude, our topic is whether my theory or Craig's is more plausible. To the extent that Craig's charges of obscurity make trouble for my view, they make the same amount of trouble for his view and so settle nothing. Craig's other objections are inconclusive. Additionally, Craig's view still faces 3 serious problems: its inherent implausibility, as well as the sociopath problem and the mystery of wrongness. In his last speech, Dr. Craig said that God's power makes God great without causing God's greatness. Apparently, Craig's view is that the connection between God's power and God's greatness is something that, in his words, just happens, as if by magic, a view he labeled implausible in his opening speech. In light of this, Craig's complaints about the alleged mystery of how, for example, torture for fun knows to instantiate wrongness remain toothless. On supererogation, Craig didn't address the point that Christianity teaches that God commands us to be perfect, which hardly leaves room for supererogatory acts. He then reasserted, still without argument, that human brains lack mental states and the ability to generate free actions. Bald assertion of such controversial claims settles nothing, particularly since Craig's theory of free will depends on utterly mysterious interaction between bodies and souls. Finally, Craig appealed again to Plantinga's argument. That argument also settles nothing. Think of it this way. Suppose I have a lighter, which I reasonably believe is a Bic lighter, and I find that it ignites on 99 of 100 tries. That makes it reasonable for me to believe that the lighter is reliable, even if I'm aware of some guy's armchair speculations that Bic lighters are probably unreliable. Similarly, if it's reasonable for you to accept naturalism, then it's reasonable for you to believe that unguided evolution has produced mostly reliable believers, and therefore that unguided evolution tends to produce reliable believers, despite being aware of Plantinga's armchair speculations about unguided evolution. If it's reasonable to believe naturalism, Plantinga's argument does nothing to change that. Craig's objections are ineffective. Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts. You may have noticed that Craig didn't dispute these implications of his view. Indeed, he didn't mention them at all. His only reply here is that, quote, "The ultimate source of our moral obligations is far beyond our experience," end quote. So I say that the fact that you could stop 1,000,000 Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that it might seem that way, but really it takes an order from God to render that nap immoral. Second, Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong acts inexplicable, because by commanding us to do what he knows we won't do anyway, God would only create more evil. In my last speech, I pointed out a simple defect in Craig's attempt to answer this challenge. Craig didn't address this defect in his last speech, so I'll just remind you of it. Suppose I perform some evil act, like heartlessly ignoring the suffering child. Craig says that because I deserve to be punished for my evil act, God must forbid the act so that he can then punish me. The problem, again, is that if the act deserves punishment because it is evil, then God is justified in punishing me for the evil act without first forbidding the act. As I said in my last speech, if I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world creates a contradiction within Craig's view. Psychological research shows that whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right and wrong, they are incapable of grasping the authority of morality. Remember that in trying to explain how God could impose obligations on people who don't believe in him, Craig proposed that by giving non-believers an intuitive grasp of morality's demands and authority, God is able to get his commands through and impose moral obligations on non-believers. However, because psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority, God hasn't imposed any moral obligations on them, which means that, on Craig's view, they have no moral obligations. In a striking turn of events, Dr. Craig, despite having railed for years against atheism's inability to account for the moral wrongness of the acts of psychopaths, and having declared tonight that Christianity teaches that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, now entertains the possibility that psychopaths do not know the difference between right and wrong and are not culpable for their evil acts. But remember that in his flawed attempt to explain wrong action, Craig said that it was unacceptable for evildoers to get away with evil and that God would never permit such a thing. Here are Craig's own words, quote, "By issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable," end quote. So Craig must hold that psychopaths are culpable for their evil acts, and so do have moral obligations. For otherwise, some psychopaths would, as he puts it, literally get away with murder. We can now see that Craig has painted himself into a corner in tonight's debate. Since psychopaths are incapable of recognizing morality's authority, Craig must deny that they have moral obligations. Yet he must also hold that God doesn't let them get away with their evil acts, and so they do have moral obligations. I hope you will listen carefully to Dr. Craig's closing remarks and pay careful attention to what, if anything, he says about the three challenges I've just explained. The first two challenges show that Craig's view has deeply implausible implications, including that there are no wrong actions and that the fact that you could stop 1,000,000 Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. The third challenge is even more serious because it reveals a contradiction in Craig's position. Craig's position leads to the impossible view that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Please listen carefully to what, if anything, Dr. Craig has to say about these three challenges in his closing remarks. Okay, I thank Dr. Craig for a very stimulating debate, and I hope we've given you some interesting ideas to think about. I've already explained why I think Craig's objections, to my view, are ineffective. As you reflect on Craig's objections, please remember that a galloping herd of ineffective objections carries the same weight as no objections at all. In my last speech, I explained the three serious problems with Craig's theistic view that have emerged tonight. As far as I can tell, Craig didn't address the substance of any of these problems in his closing remarks. First, a central pillar of Craig's view, his moral axiom that only divine commands are sufficient by themselves to generate moral obligations, is implausible. This axiom implies that being in a situation in which you have a choice between preventing 1,000,000 holocausts and taking a nap is not by itself enough to make it wrong for you to take the nap. That implication alone seems to me to provide more than adequate grounds to set Craig's view aside and look for more promising alternatives. Since Craig mentioned my exchange with Mark Murphy in connection with this problem, you might be interested to know that Murphy rejects divine command theory on the grounds that it closes off the good of a small child's life from being the, or even a, wrong-making feature of harming the child. So, Weilenberg the atheist and Murphy the Christian are united in rejecting Craig's implausible moral axiom. I invite all of you to join us. Second, Craig's view predicts that there are no morally wrong actions. Craig has failed to explain why God wouldn't command people to do things only when his commands would influence behavior for the better. By adopting such a policy, God could prevent pointless evil from entering the world. Craig's proposal that God forbids evil actions so that he can punish evildoers fails, because if evildoing merits punishment, then God can simply punish people for their evildoing. Divine commands are unnecessary. Consequently, Craig's view cannot account for the existence of a single wrong action, and instead predicts that there are no wrong actions. This renders Craig's view inadequate as a foundation for objective morality. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world reveals a contradiction in Craig's view. To explain how divine commands might impose obligations on non-believers, Craig proposed that every human being has an intuitive grasp of morality's authority. Without at least this grasp of morality's authority, God's commands can't get through, and so on Craig's view, no moral obligations are imposed. Psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority. Craig's view therefore implies that psychopaths have no obligations. But Craig also claimed that God imposes obligations on all of humankind, so that no one is outside the scope of divine justice, ensuring that no evildoers can act with impunity. Psychopaths are paradigmatic evildoers. Psychologist Robert Hare explains that psychopaths are rational and aware of what they are doing and why, and their evil acts result not from a deranged mind, but from a cold, calculating rationality. Craig's view therefore requires that psychopaths do have moral obligations. It is thus crucial to Craig's view that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, so that they have an intuitive grasp of God's commands and their authority. And yet, psychopaths walk among us, their hearts devoid of divine inscription. Their presence reveals that Craig's view is impossible, because it implies that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Tonight we've seen that if we grant Craig's extravagant metaphysical hypothesis of an uncaused, perfect, non-physical person that somehow interacts with the physical universe, if we suppose for the sake of argument that exactly the sort of God Craig believes in exists, then the resulting picture of morality is one of implausibility, inadequacy, and impossibility. And so I think that tonight's argument suggests that my view is more plausible than Craig's. Even if God is dead, objective morality abides.